Twilight Gets a Puppy. By TDR. Chapter 52. Brindle Gossip. Part 2. Golden Oaks Library. The next morning. Twilight didn't have nightmares. Or if she did, she never recalled them. She never recalled any of her dreams really. Despite this, she felt uneasy as she heard the rooster crowing outside, the morning sun making its way through the window. She was debating on whether she should stay in bed today. There wasn't much on her to-do list and she could send Ross and Spike out for groceries, or go herself later if she felt up to it. Right now she felt like being lazy. She was far more tired than she expected to be, but that might have had to do with how mentally worn out she was after arguing with the others. She needed to reschedule some time to go have a word with Zecora to put these stupid fears to rest, though there was no telling when that might be. Particularly if she lazed in bed today, it would throw her whole schedule off. She was still debating it when she smelled smoke. There was no scent of food, and it smelled like the scrolls after Spike got a message, so it wasn't very strong. Twilight frowned and slowly sat up, opening one eye to look around. Spike wasn't in her room. She knew Ross had passed out on the couch, but Spike usually made it to his own bed. Unless he worried himself into a panic, then he tended to climb into bed with either Ross or Twilight, though the large moon dog was usually his first choice. It was a rare thing anyway. Spike wasn't prone to nightmares either. Last time he had needed her like that was when he was 3. The room was empty of any dragon siblings, but the smell of smoke lingered. Maybe Ross was trying to cook something again, though the smoke didn't have any sort of meaty smell like his usual cooking. Twilight rolled to the edge of her bed with a yawn and slipped off the edge to the floor. She had a longer drop than she expected before hitting the wood floor. That was the first warning that something was wrong. She groaned, pushing herself up onto all fours, her claws scraping the smooth wood as she gained traction. She looked up at her bed curiously. Was it always this high? She remembered being able to look down on it. Now she was eye level with her sheets. Wait. Hold on, back up. Something was wrong. What was it? Her sleep-addled mind needed to back up a bit. Fall, floor, high bed. No, between that, floor. Claws. Dropping her head down to look at her hooves, Twilight stared at the lavender-colored scales covering the 3-toed claws where her hooves should have been. Her eyes widened as she followed the dark purple-edged lavender scales up, following along her forelegs to look down at her chest, which had thicker scales of a more reddish hue like her main stripe. She turned her head, looking back at the rest of her body, her eyes getting even wider as she saw the rest of her was also covered in scales and her tail was a long serpentine one. Small dragon-like wings rested on her back with a row of reddish-hued spines running along her back and down her tail. She scrambled towards her mirror, sliding over the floor to look at herself. Her equine face had elongated considerably and now had more of a point. A pair of purple horns swept back along the top of her head, curling slightly upward. Her hair was gone, though the reddish spines lengthened atop like Zecora's hairstyle. Her eyes were the same purple color as they were supposed to be, though now they were slitted like a reptile's, and her mouth was full of sharp teeth. Given the situation, Twilight did the only sensible thing. She calmly, and with great care, screamed at the top of her lungs. This was also the point where she learned that was how dragons breathed fire, as an amethyst-colored flame erupted from her mouth and set her mirror ablaze. There was a thunderous noise from downstairs, as well as the sounds of shouting and heavy footfalls coming up the stairs. There was a clattering crash on the other side of the door before a small purple figure burst into the room, the top of his head wrapped in a blanket, causing him to stumble and crash to the floor as he got tangled in it. Twilight, what's wrong, Gaia? Spike cried out, slipping and crashing to the floor as he fought the blanket. Twilight winced, grabbing the blanket with her claws and yanking it off her youngest brother, only to find out that he wasn't the same either. Laying sprawled out on his back, rubbing his head with his forepaws, was a purple puppy with a green mass of hair on his head and tail. Twilight blinked down at Spike. Spike grumbled and looked up at Twilight. Both of them stared at each other a moment more before doing the only rational thing in this situation. They both screamed their fool heads off and Twilight set the blanket on fire. "For the sake of my ears, what in Tartarus is going on?" shouted another voice, as a larger figure picked itself up off the landing where it had fallen with a crash, a tattered maroon coat draped over it and tangled with its limbs. "Ross?" Twilight asked, looking at the covered figure stumbling in the door. "My coat. Crap, I'm twisted in this," Ross swore, pulling the coat off his head as he fell down on his rump with a wince. Twilight and Spike stared. Sitting before them on his flank was a navy-furred earth pony about the size and build of their brother's shining armor. He had a long amber mane and tail that matched his eyes, though his ears were much longer than a normal pony's, with a pair of glowing orbs at the tips. His flank was decorated with a cutie mark of a wolf's head howling before a crescent moon. Ross shook his head, lifting his forehoof to push his mane out of his face. He paused in the middle of this, looking down at where his paw should be and seeing a hoof instead. He lifted his gaze up to the dragon and dog before him as they stared at him. The three of them had done and seen a number of strange things in their lives, so they handled this as calmly and coolly as possible. By screaming like lunatics, until Twilight managed to light Ross's coat on fire, then there was even more screaming. That might have continued on for a while had not the whole treehouse begun to shake, bouncing them around on the floor and knocking things off the shelves. Then, before they could figure out what was going on, the room got darker. Turning to the window, the trio were greeted by a massive green eye peering in at them. To say there was suddenly more screaming and fire was an understatement. "I think they're awake." Applebloom's voice boomed out over the town. Author's note: a bit short, but the setup was too nice to avoid. End author's note. End chapter 52. Brindle Gossip. Part 2.